So our topic today is democracy and political development in Asia. There's no question but that democracy is under stress, not just in Asia, but globally as well. Even I read the theme for Davos this year is dealing in a fractured world. So consider that you've saved $70,000 in Davos tickets, not to mention lift tickets and air tickets by coming to this program instead. And we'll dive into the issue of how democracy is developed in these three very, very important countries: Japan, Indonesia, and Myanmar, Burma. And we're lucky to have three really terrific experts, Takako and Dewi and Derek. When we look at the countries, the three countries, obviously we'll explore similarities, and it may be that Japan in some respects is an outlier in that it's ethnically homogeneous. I think it's an island nation with fixed historic borders. It's Northeast Asia, not Southeast Asia. It's never been colonized, although it's certainly been occupied, and arguably has had at least a century head start over Indonesia and Myanmar in terms of Western-style democracy. Whereas Indonesia and Myanmar have arguably a lot more in common, but that's something that we certainly can test and delve into. What I hope that we can explore more deeply are questions like what are the conditions, what are some of the factors that help drive economic, not limited to economic factors, but that help drive political reform in these three countries and in the region. What were some of the challenges, and what's helped or hindered the effort to overcome these challenges in the three countries and in the region more broadly, because I think what we're really getting at is what are the applicable lessons for today when, in fact, there are pressures on democratic institutions and traditions, and importantly, when there is now the emergence with a rising China. Certainly anyone who's listened to the messaging coming out of China since the 19th Party Congress has heard this concept of a new model, kind of global governance with Chinese characteristics. So I'd like to begin, if I could, with Takako, in deference in part to the 150th anniversary, but also to sort of set a little bit of a benchmark to describe, in the first instance, Japan's experiment with democratic reform, and then go on to Dewi and to Derek.
Thank you, Danny. Since it will take a very long time if I were to talk about the 150 years history of Japan's process, I'd like to focus a bit on what happened in Meiji and maybe talk about what happened afterwards in the discussion. But focusing on three concepts, just to try to make my presentation brief, three concepts being institutionalization, indigenization, and to explain the limits of democratization in Meiji, the instrumental nature of democracy when it was introduced in Meiji. And so Edmund Reischauer, the great scholar and former ambassador to Japan from 1961 to 66, once said, "Japan stands alone as the one great non-Western nation to have made the transition to a modernized society, an economy with relatively little turmoil and extraordinary success." And his statements back then was somewhat controversial among the academics who thought that the Meiji roots are a lot more conservative, feudal, and not quite helpful. I think it's fair to say, if there is any misperception that Japan's democracy started in 1945, that's not true either. And there was something that happened before that in the Meiji era that is relevant. And the question, I guess, is the relevance today. As Danny went on with a list of difference between Japan and other countries for me, so I don't have to repeat that, but just in terms of not just as a country, but the timing. The Meiji period, obviously, the economy was not as globalized as it is today, so the impact of that is very different at the domestic level. And also the imperatives were different, that there was a time where Japan was fearful that it might be colonized by Western powers. And that's not exactly what's going on right now as for the external impact. But still, I think there are interesting lessons to be learned. And if there isn't that much of familiarity with what happened 150 years ago compared to what happened after 1945, I thought it might be useful for me to do as quickly as possible an overview of what happened in Meiji. And since I didn't remember all my years right, as a good Japanese high school student should do, I have my cheat sheet right here. So what happened in 1868? The overthrow of Tokugawa shogunate by rebel forces in the name of the emperor led to the imperial restoration and formation of government. And in 1968, the 5 charter oath was pronounced by the Meiji leaders, consisting of 5, obviously: parliamentary democracy, democratic participation, egalitarianism, meaning eliminating the class distinction that existed until then, progressivism, and also international search for knowledge to strengthen the foundations of international life. And just to try to summarize what happened after that in terms of institutionalization is that state building came before the parliamentary part of the story, that in 1868, the ministries, such as foreign affairs, justice, finance, and so forth, started in 1868, and relatively quickly in 1887, a meritocratic exam system was introduced. After that, there was the feudal lord run local heirs were replaced by prefectures, and a universal conscription system was established very early in 1873, and a centralized and standardized taxation on agricultural lands took place the same year in 1873. So if you think about how it started in 1968, that's actually quite a short period of time to achieve all these, considering the changes, the massive level of changes that must have been about this nation-building part. And after that, obviously, there were, in the 5 Charter Oath, in a way, a promise to introduce some kind of a parliamentary system. There were calls from that from domestic leaders, and that in 1881, imperial ordinance for the establishment of a diet was pronounced, and the Constitution of the Emperor of Japan was enacted in 1889. And in 1890, the first general election took place. And just to put this in context, so the voting rights were given to male 25 years and above, and those who paid more than 15 yen tax, which will be everybody basically right now, but obviously 15 yen was worth a lot more, and it was about 1% of the electorate. And although that seems very limited, just as a comparative figure, in France, I just Googled this to find out that in 1830, only 0.6% of the population was actually given the rights to vote. So given the comparison between 1830 and 1890, it wasn't that limited compared to other countries. And the voting rights were gradually expanded to universal suffrage in 1925. And women's rights to vote, it did not happen until 1946, but it is noteworthy that as early as in 1931, the lower house did pass a bill to actually allow for women to vote. Unfortunately, the upper house did not approve it. And that is actually quite early compared to the US, which was 1920, and the UK, which was 1920 as well. So in a way, Japan was more progressive than you might think in terms of that. And majority of the parliamentarians that were elected were important farmers and the landed gentry. But I guess that's the foundation, and I guess the characterization of how it happened is my second point of indigenization, is that the Western concepts were not just brought in by a very limited number of people, but it was actually very much brought into the political discourse, not just at the elite level, but also at the local level in a very quick way, and also in a very expansive way from not just the governmental system, but the education system and so forth. What really helped in the beginning is that the level of education literacy rate in the Edo period preceding the Meiji Restoration was quite already high. So there were already different local warlords who had sent people abroad, expecting some kind of a foreign influence to happen prior to the Meiji Restoration, which helped in terms of the language. But the government also sent more than 100 people in 1871 for an exploratory mission for 2 years. And you just imagine 100 government people traveling for 2 years in 1871 to the West is actually a big deal. And a lot of the people who took part in that mission came back to Japan to become leaders in the democratization and the nation-building efforts. And the second point, next to the, after the number of people who were sent, was that a lot of the concepts were translated into Japanese. And it's interesting that later on, the concepts themselves translated once into Japanese was exported to other Asian countries after it was once translated into Japanese. So it actually had that impact of introducing Western ideas into Asian language. A lot of it actually initiated in Japan during the Meiji period. I think that's an interesting point. And the reason why it was indigenized, I say, is that there was a competition between different models. The government wanted to introduce the German or Prussian system, but there were groups who wanted to have a parliamentary democracy like the British model, and there were others who wanted a more direct democracy type of model like the French. So there was enough internal discourse within Japan about the form of government, which made the debate about introducing Western concepts a lot about themselves, and not about just introducing just cherry-picking something that works best for the government. So there was a lot of disputed discussion about how exactly democracy took take form in Japan. And it's also interesting to note that it wasn't just in the central government, but local democratization leaders, which tended to be the relatively wealthy landlords groups initially, but still, local leaders tried hard to read and adopt the translations of the Western concepts to make a case for their own democratization effort at the local level. So the knowledge actually spread more because people wanted to achieve a democratization. It's true that for a lot of people it's frustrating. The state building came first, and they started collecting taxes before they had a say. So I think it's interesting how, more so than you might think, the Western thinking was introduced and also adopted among the local leaders and became a political discussion sooner than you thought. And later on, as suffrage voting rights were expanded, the discussion started to involve urban intellectuals and industrialists, which actually gave a different taste to the discussion. Finally, just to highlight one, I think mostly unlikely to you, which is that if you think of Meiji Japan, you think of Japanese women just following guys from behind. But in fact, as early as in 1882, women's middle school, senior school at the public schools were opened. And actually, women going to secondary school was higher in terms of percentage than men at one point because they did not have a requirement to serve in the military. So it was 9% in 1920, 15% in 1925. And another sort of Western influence is that there was a lot of Christian missionaries that started women's schools in Japan. I actually went to a school that was founded by Canadian missionaries in 1884. So that's very old. And a lot of men went to Christian school as well. And there were also, want to note is that the 100% plus people mission to the US actually included 5 women who later became leaders on its own in Japan. So that's kind of the unlikely story, which I think is interesting. But why then, since democratization concept was brought in and localized and indigenized, what happened? What was the limitation? I would like to point out the instrumental nature of how democracy was understood and used by the political leaders as to be one hypothesis to throw out, try to make a general case about what happened, which is that although people believed in people's rights, they thought it was a good thing, individualism was a good thing, it tended to be translated into political motivation for external reasons to demonstrate to the Western powers that Japan was a civilized society. And domestically, to dampen the anti-government fervor, they brought in democracy slowly to actually be able to make what they want to do possible. And finally, to deliver welfare benefits and the fruits of imperial success in much democratic form as possible so that there wouldn't be so much domestic opposition to what they were trying to do externally. So it was seen by some by a tool to build a strong state, not to respond to the people. And so individualism, even called for that, was not really to promote individual people's thinking, but to be individualistic enough to care about their own national thing. So it was translated into more of a national pride, a national individualism. So I think there's a lot of different reasons why it didn't work out, but I do think that if we think about the conceptual issues, this might be an interesting point to discuss further. Mm-hmm. So finally, democratization of Japan did not begin in 1945. Although it might be called the semi-democratic regime, it was laid very important foundations. Secondly, democratization is not a linear process, and that Japan had its own backsliding experience in the 20s and 30s. But I think what the important takeaway is that it shouldn't be seen as a state-building case where it shows that the Asian values would not translate into Japan. I think it actually is the case in which Western ideas actually were brought in. And although the way in which it took place was instrumental in nature, still there's something about the fact that how the concepts were very much indigenized in the political discussion that does have a meaning to today's Asia. So that, I think, is the reason why it might be important to reflect upon what happened 150 years ago, not just for the understanding of Japan, but also for the lessons to this day, not just the good lessons, but also the hard lessons that Japan learned.
Thanks. Thank you, Takako. Well, democratization is not a linear process.
Right.
That's either the good news or the bad news.
Right.
That's what we want to explore. Well, you've described how these indigenous factors made Japan receptive to political reform. And you described what sounds like an external stimulus, the fear of colonization and the urgency of modernization as one of the triggers or drivers behind it. Let's fast forward 100 or so years to reformasi in Indonesia. Can you just sort of talk us through the basics of what happened and why?
Well, Danny, when we need to talk, understand reformasi, I think we also need to understand that this is not the first time Indonesia experimented with democracy. I'm a bit awkward to talk here because there are some in the audience who are experts on Indonesia, but I'll try to cover 70 years of Indonesian history in 7 minutes. So if we know, and this is not just in Indonesia, many parts of the world, in Myanmar, in Egypt, in Iraq, the post-Second World War period saw the development, the flourishing of democracy in newly independent countries. One reason, of course, is that because the victorious powers, the allied powers, are all democracies. So in Indonesia, it was decided that Indonesia would practice at the time parliamentary democracy. So throughout the 1950s, Indonesia experimented with very, very liberal parliamentary democracy, a multi-party system. But unfortunately, that experiment fell flat within 7 years because we don't need to go, why, you don't have the necessary institutions, you have not really built the sufficient human resources for it, the culture is not really developed, and economic development, is still at a very low stage. But at the time, one of the fundamental problems was that Indonesia was still debating fundamental issues, like the place of Islam in the political system. So the debate about ideology made into a very polarizing situation. And at the time, of course, there were a multi-party system. Even until now, no single party had a majority, and governments rose and fell at a very, very rapid succession. So sometimes a cabinet would last 3 months, 6 months. Within 7 years, there were 7 cabinets. Mm-hmm. As a result of that failure, which exacerbated regional tensions, it led to regional rebellions, it led to various conflicts between the political elites, it led to stagnation in policy and in development. The word liberal democracy itself became demonized. So democracy at the time lost its credibility. It was seen to be a Western import, which was not suitable for Indonesia, for its culture, for its political development, for its economic stage of development. So not only was democracy abandoned, but the concept of democracy itself became, alienated. That it is not something that we should aspire to at a certain stage. It was just abandoned because it was regarded to be something that is externally imposed in our society. So the lesson is that after that, we had 40 years of authoritarian rule. First, Sukarno's guided democracy between 1959 and 1965. And then after that, a very stable New Order government under President Suharto. Military-dominated New Order government under Suharto. Now, do not be mistaken to think that the New Order government is a simple military dictatorship. In fact, I would argue that the transition in Myanmar towards democracy now is not Indonesia 1998, but Indonesia 1966. Because the New Order government was constitutionalist in the sense that Indonesia returned to its earlier 1945 constitution, in which there is an article that allowed for the appointment of functional groups, for representatives of functional groups to sit in parliament. But this tiny clause was exploited to the full by the military to justify its dual function, its defense and social political role. And the military were allocated seats in parliament, Myanmar, about 100 seats in parliament. They were allowed to occupy elected positions. So a lot of the governors and district regions were from the military. Indonesia had elections regularly every 5 years, but the elections were state-managed. The government established a party, Golkar, which was backed by the military and the bureaucracy, and was simply created to mobilize supports every 5 years. And in fact, I'm ashamed to tell you that we asked the junta in Myanmar, and I said, clean up your act a bit and just follow the Dewi Fungsi in Indonesia, you know. And it was very stable. The mantra of the New Order government was political stability, economic development, and social equity. And Indonesia at the time was one of the 10 economic miracles. It worked very, very well. And you can say that Indonesia, there was a general acceptance for a trade-off, that political exclusion for economic inclusion. So Indonesians were willing to pay the price of having less civil and political rights in order to enjoy stable economic growth and equity. And as we know, that worked very well for 32 years. But then came the financial crisis, and everything collapsed. So this can be seen that even a very successful semi-democratic government, or we never call the New Order government just semi-democratic, we just call it authoritarian. It has its use by date because it contains internal contradictions in itself. Because in a country as diverse as Indonesia, it is impossible to have coercive rule at all times. Now, to build your political legitimacy only on one pillar, economic development, it means that you have to be successful at all times. The moment you're no longer successful, that particular pillar collapses. Yeah. Now, beginning in early 1990s, there were already calls for the political opening of the New Order government, because that is the irony of a successful model, is that you educate your people. Indonesia developed a huge middle class, and they don't just learn to be doctors and engineers. Some of us learn to be political scientists and another thing. But even engineers, in Indonesian history, a lot of the political leaders, Sukarno was an engineer and an architect. So there were demands for political participations even at the height of the success of the New Order government. And in fact, in 1995, my institute, myself, I took part in a study that was commissioned by President Suharto to look at when can we wind down the Dewi Fungsi, the dual function of the military. So in 1995, we wrote 2 studies at LIPI, at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. One on looking at the social political role of the military, and second at the reform of the political parties. So we projected in 1995 that we would need about 20 years. So by 2015, we would be able to end the dual functions. We would then, democratize political parties. Under the New Order government, only 3 parties were allowed. Golkar, which is not regarded as a party, therefore it could have its base to the sub-district level, while you have the Islamic Party and Nationalist Party, since they are political parties, they are not allowed to operate below the district level. So, that is, advantages to Golkar. They were able to mobilize supports at the grassroots level, and so they were always able to garner about 70% of 70 to 73% of the vote. But as you know, the financial crisis came, and in Indonesia, the financial crisis was not just financial in the end. It became a systemic crisis. It became a multidimensional crisis because within one sweep, the government lost its legitimacy. And then you saw a revival of violence, communal conflicts, happenings, religious conflicts, conflicts between different ethnic groups. You saw religious conflicts in Ambon. You saw communal conflicts in Kalimantan between the Dayaks and the Maduris. You have regional rebellions in Aceh, and then more grievances in Papua. So there was real concerns that Indonesia would go the way that the Soviet Union would go. That it would simply break apart, the balkanization of Indonesia. So in the end, in order to deal with all of this crisis, the first thing that we must do is to restore the legitimacy of the state. The state lost its legitimacy. The military was vilified. The police, which was subsumed under the military, was not able to carry out its policy. And the government lost control. Lawlessness became an issue. You saw riots, people just taking over land and so on. So Indonesia was in a very, very serious situation. And so every party at the time believed that the only way in order to restore the authority of the state is to create a legitimate government. And in order to have a legitimate government, you need to have legitimate representatives. And the only way to do it is to have a full functioning democracy, not a state-managed democracy. So we really need to have a fully open, fair elections, that people should be able to elect their leaders and fire them if they don't want to, and so on. So that became a need, So in order to restore Indonesia to normalcy, in order to carry out economic development again, we need to restore the authority of the state. And in order to restore authority, political legitimacy is a necessity. So it's no longer just, you can have legitimacy from economic development. We've done that. We've tried that, but it turned out that, as I said, there is an expiry date for that. There's a diminishing return for that. So democracy became very, very, a very powerful call of reformasi, ending the dui fungsi, ending the social political role of the military, opening the political system, allowing other parties to contest elections. So within 6 months, President Habibie and we all decided to bring the election forward. 200 new political parties registered, and in the end, 48 contested. So it became very, very, very open. And why did it work? And I think I'll be the first to say that Indonesian democracy is still very much a work in progress. There are a lot of, the deepening and the institutionalization of democracy is still, still has some way to go. But if one looks at what is happening in the Middle East, the whole of the Arab Spring, which collapsed, why Egypt very quickly returned to authoritarian rule, I think there are some factors why in Indonesia it worked. Firstly, we are lucky that despite the social political role of the military, the Indonesian military doesn't have a traditions of coup d'etat, unlike in Thailand. So it always ruled through this constitution, loophole in the constitutions. So we ended the dual functions through a consultative assembly decree, but after that we amended the constitution. We closed the loophole. It is no longer possible for a non-elected individual to go to parliament. So in one stroke, you close all possibility for military to get appointed seats, or for anybody to get appointed seats. So the willingness of the military to support the reform, I think we should give them credit that they're willing to be reformed, and they did not go out of their way to protect Suharto and maintain power. The second thing that's very most is important, and which is probably missing, in many Middle Eastern countries, is this strength of Indonesian civil society. Civil society in Indonesia has always been very, very vibrant, and the most important civil society in Indonesia is actually Muslim-based civil society, which predated the Indonesian state. We have the two largest Islamic mass organizations in the world. One, Nahdlatul Ulama, which is associated with traditional Islam, and one is Muhammadiyah, which is associated with modernist Islam. Nahdlatul Ulama claims to have about 40 million members, and Muhammadiyah claims about 30 million members. We don't really know, probably more than that, not card-carrying members, but Indonesia can just be divided into these two. And the mass organizations are in support of this democratic movement. If you remember, the leader of Muhammadiyah was Gus Dur, Abdul Rahman Wahid. The leader of Nahdlatul Ulama is Abdul Rahman Wahid. The leader of Muhammadiyah is Amin Rais. These two individuals were the leaders of the democratic transition movement, and they played an incredibly critical role, in overseeing the management of the democratic transition. So you have the Muslim groups being the main drivers for democratic transitions, and because of this, it is also possible for Indonesia to avoid the debate again about the role of Islam in politics. There is concern that, again, the issue of Islam and politics would again divide the nations. But here we are safe by our national ideology. We have Pancasila, which of course is missing in many, many Muslim countries in the Middle East. We have an ideology that transcends ethnicity, that transcends religion. So it is a unifying ideology. And when we carried out constitutional amendment, we decided to do it through amendment rather than rewriting a totally new constitution. It was agreed by all parties that the preamble to the constitution would not be touched. And in the preamble of the constitution, Pancasila was very much embedded there. So by having a national platform, it is possible for the various parties to talk about very difficult issues, but at least we have common denominator, So we talk about what form of party politics we will have and so on, but it is not something that will break you apart. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, and this is also very, very important, the role of intellectuals, the think tanks. Because students can storm the barricades, the castle can fall, but what do you do once you're inside? You need to be able to draft policies. You need to be able to draft amendments to the constitutions, to have new ideas about what shape of the political system they are going to have. And who's going to do it? It's the intellectuals, it's the universities, it's the think tanks, and so on. This is often not given sufficient attention by people who study about democracy, but the role of the think tanks cannot be underestimated, because for many years, as I say, like my own institute, we have been asked about what we should be doing in terms of reforming the military, reforming the political parties. And the Habibie Center at the time was also the people who were involved there, that came after the Habibie period, actually. But we already had ideas of what we wanted to do. We wanted to end the dual function. We wanted to carry out a wide-ranging decentralization. Because in Indonesia, because of the nature of the archipelago and the very the huge diversity, the kind of unified system under the New Order government, that everything is cookie cut, designed in Jakarta and replicated, at all levels from Aceh to Papua. That felt to people, and I come from West Sumatra that was involved in regional rebellion, that felt a being of some domination and colonization, Javanization. That also led to grievances. So decentralization is very much part of Indonesia's democratizations. And I think on the whole, it has worked. Indonesia is now recognized as the world's third largest democracy, and it is, by later surveys, people continue to hold democratic ideals very, very dearly. But lessons from the past are never far from our mind. You can never take democracy for granted because we failed in the 1950s. So from the New Order government, people have also enjoyed political stability and economic development. And now people expect the same things from their democratic leaders. So it is no longer sufficient for Indonesia simply to have political participation, to have the rights to choose your leaders or to go and every Tom, Dick, and Harry thinks that he can be president or she can be president now. Since a small town mayor can go to Jakarta. Now every mayor in the country, thinks that they could make it, which is what democracy is all about. But at the same time now, the benchmark is higher also. People actually expect the government to deliver. They expect stability. They expect roads to be built. They expect education. They expect healthcare and so on. So now our challenge is how to ensure that democracy is productive. So it's not just about elections, but it's also about policy. And this is the lessons learned from the 1950s. If you don't get democracy to be productive, then it can also lose its legitimacy. But then we also have, like in many other countries, a democratic dilemma. The democratic space is not just enjoyed by civic-minded and liberal democratic ideals, but people who do not like democracy are also taking part in the process. Radical ideas, hate speech also find their way into Indonesian politics. We can discuss this later. So now we are in a bind in a way. Now the government has just, the presidential decree said that the government can, without recourse to court, can now disband mass organizations if it is found to be anti-constitutional. So through that presidential decree, the government has been able to disband Hizb ut-Tahrir Indonesia, because Hizb ut-Tahrir openly champions a caliphate. So it's not Indonesian and it's not Pancasila. But this has created a lot of debates among democracy activists. Should we again give the government the right to do this kind of thing? So in the social media, there are a lot of hate speech. So the government is now also introducing, we have created a new cyber agency. And the government is trying to monitor also hate speech and but this again creates a lot of discussions. Is this a slippery slope? If you allow it to open, then it can create conflicts. You give impact, in fact, especially when the threats of terrorism and radicalism and extremism and so on, which use social media. But if you again allow the government to control this, are we in a slippery slope again? This issues needs to be constantly debated. But the fact that it is debated shows that I think that the democracy is alive and well. Finally, we still have problem in terms of substance, quality, because Indonesian politics is still very much personalized. Political parties are not yet doing their proper job as political parties to be truly representative of people, that they give political indications and so on. Political parties in Indonesia are not terribly based on ideology, therefore it's very transactional. And now, if you look at surveys, political parties and parliament have the lowest grade because they are all involved in corruption. So this is a real danger for democracy institutionalization, if people don't trust their members of parliaments because they're seen to be corrupt. But on the positive side, precisely because Indonesian political parties are so transactional, regardless of whether they're Islamist parties or secular parties, they're all engaged in corrupt activities. But they are also, it's easy to make a deal, to make a compromise. So when Joko Widodo came to power, he was directly elected as president, but the party was actually controlled by parties that supported General Prabowo. But within 3 months, the majority of the parties that supported Prabowo decided to join the cabinet. So now the president is able to pass laws because he has majority support in parliament. So you can say they're transactional parties, they're hopeless and so on. But on the other hand, it prevented polarization in Indonesian politics because the political parties are willing to make compromises.
Well, thank you, Dewi. You raised so many points that we really need to think about and come back to: the role of the military, the economic factors, the role of civil society, the impact and implications of religion and ethnic divides in cultures. Specifically in the case of Indonesia, you're describing an external economic factor, the Asia financial crisis, as a trigger in the sense that it precipitated not just an economic crisis, as you said, but a crisis of legitimacy for the authoritarian government. You described the willingness of the military to support and in fact, to get on board with political reform, the strength of civil society, the strong national identity that helped mitigate some of the religious considerations. All of this is very relevant to what we're going to ask Derek to walk us through in Burma and Myanmar. I have to worry also that your description of democracy faltering in the 50s in Indonesia after 7 years gives me chills, because it's just about 7 years since the beginning of reform, depending on how you count it, in Burma and Myanmar. But let me give you the floor, Derek, and ask you to help us understand the extraordinary political transformation in Myanmar.
Well, thank you, Danny. First of all, it's great to see you again. We worked very closely when I was in the Pentagon, and Danny was at State, and then together when I was ambassador and worked on Myanmar. I'm also very well aware of the fact that we have Takako's Japanese talking about Japan, we have Dewi Indonesian talking about Indonesia, and I am American talking about Myanmar, trying to make assumptions and analysis of what Myanmar's history is and the meaning of its democratic transition. I do see many parallels, listening to Dewi, to what is happening in Myanmar, but also, as you say, some divergences. The first parallel I would say, well, just going through history here, I mean, for years, Myanmar, known as Burma, was dominated by monarchies, dominated by kings, mostly by military conquerors who held the place together by force. And they'd trade places over centuries, until that was sort of pre-18th century, and then in the 19th century, you had British colonialism that came in steadily, that dominated the country until 1885, when it took over the entire country. And that was the defining characteristic of the country through World War II. You had then an independence movement under Aung San Suu Kyi's father, that sought for independence and pride and Burman dignity and democratic future. So after the World War II, you had a new constitution and a transition to a democracy under, first Aung San was going to lead it, then he was assassinated, and then on to elections where a prime minister named U Nu basically dominated the period of the 1950s. So when you talk about Indonesia having a democracy 7 years and failing, Myanmar as well, then Burma, also had democracy in the 1950s that we need to be aware of. The fact that this isn't new in that sense to them. They had tested it during the period of about, off and on, they had a coup in 58 and another coup in 62, once and for all, so 13 years or so, where they tested democracy. And during that period, like in Indonesia, it was quite rough. They're very diverse, like in Indonesia. They'd been having a long-running civil war. It's the longest-running civil conflict going on in the world. It's still going on. Basically, since independence, the ethnic nationalities have been fighting each other for ethnic rights and to define what this democracy should look like, in essence. So you've had that aspect, and I think the chaotic nature of democracy in the 1950s added to the civil war that was expanding. Then the military had this sort of presumption that we are the only thing that can hold this place together. We're the only way we can provide stability. Democracy had its day. It could not succeed. There is chaos. We need to step in order to make sure the unity, the territorial integrity, and the security of the country is protected. So they did that in 1962. They established an autarkic that kind of closed off the country, kicked out Indians and Chinese and foreigners basically over time, became autarkic and closed, steadily evolved to a one-party dictatorship in the 1970s, and went from, unfortunately, even though it was a chaotic democracy, it was a fairly prosperous one in its time, in its way. It was the leading rice bowl. I mean, it was the leading exporter of rice. So it went from the rice bowl of Asia to, by the 1980s, the basket case of Asia, one of the 10 least developed countries in Asia, in the world. So by the time of the 80s and the mid-80s and then 87, 88, there was economic mismanagement, and the people were more and more frustrated by all of this, by the closing off and by the economic malfeasance. They took to the streets. There was a democracy movement. People were shot down in the streets because of students who were promoting democracy, and that's where Aung San Suu Kyi entered the scene. She came in 1988, taking care of her sick mother, And she became naturally the leader because of her pedigree. She was the daughter of Aung San. Aung San was the representation of the great hope, the hope that was dashed in his assassination, that was lost, that they reached back and said, that was where we went wrong. If we only had those days back, we would have a real democracy, we would have peace, we would have real unity instead of the false unity of a military dictatorship and the oppression and the suppression of all of our rights that we enjoyed in the 50s, and that even before, during the colonial days, there was oppression, but they had ability to speak and to express themselves. So that movement started in the late 80s. The military toyed with it, allowed for an election in 1990. Aung San Suu Kyi, they thought, was well controlled under house arrest. But her party ran for the elections and won basically the same landslide they won in 2015, which is remarkable. You look at the results in 2015, in 1990 it was the same. But they said, no, actually, the people don't know what's good for them. What they were actually voting for anyway was a constitution, not real democratic change. This isn't good for the place. So we will then establish a constitutional process and not accept the election. And they basically spent another 25 years of systematic degradation and isolation because the world would not accept this truncated democratic moment. And it was identified in the person of Aung San Suu Kyi. So you fast forward to 2011, and Aung San Suu Kyi went in and out of house arrest. People were still promoting democracy. You had the monks in the street in 2007 overturning their bowls, the saffron revolution. And then the demand of the world to change, for them to change. And if you ask, why did they change? If you ask the government, when I was there, the Myanmar government, they'll say, we intended to do this. We had a 7-step roadmap that we established in 2003. That was meant to first have a constitution, ratify the constitution, have elections, and then have a transition to a new government. And there was a transition to democracy. That was all very controlled. It was the controlling aspect, as you say, the military control of a disciplined democracy, they called it. So by the time of 2011, they would say, we believe in democracy. We have a new constitution. We had elections in 2010. We're turning over power to this new government, which was really a former just military and civilian clothes. And then they reached out, and we reached out to them to test them and said, well, you talk a good game of democracy, but if you're truly for democracy, you would have political prisoners, because the political prisoners are promoting democracy. They would be allies of yours. If you truly believed in peace and democracy, you would then talk to the ethnic nationalities and not fight them, etc. I do not think they had a roadmap. After the 7-step roadmap, that's where it ended in their concept of what came next. So by the time we engaged in 2011, many of them did say, quietly to me, they'd say, we looked around the region. We saw we were backward economically. We knew we were isolated. We didn't like to be isolated. And we also saw that the democracies seemed to be doing well. And the non-democracies were not. We want to be more like Japan or Korea or Taiwan, I suppose. Or, in the 1990s, they would say, we want to be like Indonesia, when some of us were out there promoting democracy. That was the Fungsi time. And we were like, no, not Indonesia. And then by the early 2000s, we're like, yes, Indonesia. That's a good model. And we would use it back at them. It's like, well, yeah, you can make a transition. See, you can do this. So their constitution, I think they felt, was their insurance policy. They had 25% of the parliament for the military. They controlled the 3 key ministries of defense, interior, and border. They still had the guns. They still had prerogatives. And they still, of course, at that time had the leadership. So the election happened. I don't think they had a roadmap for how this was going to go. I think we helped, because of some reformers inside. They ended up reforming more than I think they expected in 2011. The election, I don't think they had even if they wanted to, and there were indications they may have wanted to, but they couldn't control the result. So they had to turn over power to Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think they felt, well, we have at least enough control under the Constitution to allow us to happen. The final thing I'll say, I don't want to go on too long now, I know we're basically into Q&A time, is what's different from Indonesia, what's missing, unfortunately, and from Japan, from 150 years ago, I would say. For Japan, I know that's asking a lot for 150 years. I would start with that. Myanmar doesn't have the space Japan had. to test, to work this through, have a year of sending people overseas and work all this through in a very systematic way. They have peace, they have economic reform, political reform. They've opened up a Pandora's box, as you all know from the front pages, of social unrest and division in the country, not just by ethnicity, which we've all noticed because of the Civil War, but by religion, or at least with a Rohingya for race, or it mixes all these things. They're dealing with all of these things at once. I mean, they've kind of put it in amber because of the military. 50 years they weren't able to deal with these fundamental questions. They also don't have a fundamental answer to the issue of identity. Who are we as a country? They've been fighting it out through military means for all this time. They've never actually come to a conclusion of what kind of country are we? What are the foundational principles? Equal justice under law for everybody, or just for certain populations? What is the distribution of power? How we deal with federalism? I used to call federalism the F word there, because you couldn't mention federalism. To them, that meant separatism. They haven't worked all this out, and they have to do that even as they're developing their economy, even as they're developing the basics of political reform and democracy. And the other thing they don't have, because of military dictatorship, are the institutions. Mm-hmm. The military was the only functioning institution. They degraded every other institution in the country. So they don't have a government to do it with. They don't have a bureaucracy to do it with. You have civil society and activists who have ideas, but they're trying to learn. You have also a state councilor, a leader who was isolated for 25 years, and and not necessarily as worldly as we had hoped she might be in understanding how to be the politician for this moment and the leader that we would hope her to be. So they have a lot of, I used to say, you can't cut off your knees, and expect to run. And they've cut off their knees and be in a ditch. They dug a ditch for 50 years. They can't run very fast, and yet, and I'm not saying we shouldn't expect more out of them. We absolutely should, and I'm sure we'll get to that in Q&A. This is not an excuse for them, but it's an explanation of the fact that they don't have necessarily, I think, some of the advantages that maybe the Meiji Japanese and the Indonesians had, even if there are some parallels.
Wow. Well, we will go in one moment to questions. I wonder, in sort of lightning round style, maybe if I could ask, to your point, Derek, that you heard from the Burmese military, from the junta, that they looked around and saw a correlation between democracy and prosperity, and that in addition to all the other factors, innate longing for justice, empowerment, the issue of legitimacy, there was a very direct connection between reforming towards democracy and getting on the program that connects to real prosperity and real opportunity. In Asia of 2018, is that still the predominant view? Do Asians, particularly, do Southeast Asians continue to view democracy as part of the pathway to economic growth and prosperity, or is there rethinking or even an alternative model, the Chinese authoritarian model that is emerging as a preferred alternative?
Well, Danny, for Asia, even especially for fast economically developing Asia, the developmentalist model is not a new Chinese model. It was the old South Korean model, the Taiwanese model. So you have more or less a very autocratic leader. You have the institutions, but you subvert the institutions so that it saves the executive. You have parliament, but it is rubber stamp. You have the judiciary. You have all, in Indonesia, you have all of them on papers, but they were under the subordination of the military. So when we're talking about the model, I hardly think that it will be the Chinese model, because there is an early and successful model which Indonesia practiced. And for Indonesia, we said, it doesn't work. It worked very well for 3 decades, but when it collapsed, it was very, very, there's no way to resurrect it you have to have a different model. So Indonesia, there's not much appetite in general for that kind of model, although there are leftover. After all, the New Order government is around for a long time. There are those who miss the Suharto era. But if you're talking about Southeast Asia has always been divided, as you know, between the more democratic ones, the really, really non-democratic one, and the semi one, like Singapore and Malaysia, and so on, where they have elections, but they also have Internal Security Act. They have constraints on democracy. But if we ask 2 or 3 years ago, particularly after the Myanmar transition, the mood within ASEAN was very hopeful that democracy was the new narrative, that ASEAN will really become a democracy. We had the ASEAN Charter, which actually put the language about democracy and human rights in the charter. It was signed in at the end of 2007. So there was a lot of hope. But Thailand, again, became under military junta and not a squeak from ASEAN. Then you have the Philippines, where you have a democratically elected president who openly carries out extrajudicial killing, and his popularity continues to go up. So this is problematic. The choice is not for the Chinese model, but democracy is in trouble within at least within the ASEAN context. Indonesia used to work together with Thailand and the Philippines to engage Myanmar, to prod Myanmar towards political transition. Now Indonesia feels quite alone. We don't have many friends.
You have a lot of friends. Anything you would care to add?
So I guess it's really not, like for Japan, the question is not that relevant. But if we were to look back on when countries can transition from semi-democratic to democratic, and when they backslide to authoritarianism, because Japan, that happened. And I guess looking at that, just to say that I mentioned the universal suffrage, or happened in 1925, when that's the year that the Internal Order Law was put in place. And part of the reason why that was the case was, it was interesting that you mentioned about how it's not the military coup, or it's not, in Japan's case, a very charismatic leader. It's more of the loophole and the system that the military could take advantage of, because within the Constitution, the supreme command of the Army and Navy was to the emperor. So in a way, that was meant to actually to separate the military from the politics, but they used it as a way to approach, or not to go through the political process that. And later, when they noticed about the loophole, and when their interests did not converge anymore from the leader. So that's one point that I thought was interesting that you mentioned. But I guess the question, going back to which path, I think that Japan and Meiji had much longer time to split. I think Myanmar must be dog years or whatever years, if the Meiji Japan was whatever year. But I think what you mentioned about whether democracy can deliver is very important. Because it's not really that the military in Japan's case was a coup, it's more of a creeping militarization when the democratic leaders could not deliver, and the military was kind of seen as a way, and the military policy of expansion was seen as a way for the Japanese people to actually have what they needed to be delivered, or that at least the Japanese politicians or military leaders who wanted to make that case could make that case, because it seemed like the democratic alternative wasn't really getting to them. And even though Meiji was much slower, and I guess in Japan's case, things really accelerated after 1929, the Great Depression, that the market became a lot more relevant for Japan. As they industrialized, resources became more important. So these as they caught up with what was happening in the world, the question of who can deliver rose. And unfortunately, in that case for Japan, the answer that the military or the more conservative leaders provided tended to be more of a tangible benefit for the populace, because it's not that, although opposition leaders were oppressed, and that's the actual authoritarianism that took place, it's also true that most of the public went along what was happening in terms of expansionist policy, including the so-called intellectuals of that time. So that, I think, as a lesson, as you mentioned, I think the bar is even higher now. It's much more difficult now for democracy to deliver what the constituents want, and it's very hard to do that. But I think the other choice is actually not that clear what they can deliver. So why, how to appeal for the democratic way of people getting what they want is going to be what's going to be challenging for Asian countries today.
Well, Derek, you laid out some the challenges that Aung San Suu Kyi and the democratically elected civilian government are facing, which are tremendously daunting challenges. Do you find any buyer's remorse within the Burmese political community now?
Well, I left as ambassador 2 years ago. I'm not talking to folks the same way, but I don't think so. I don't think they want to. I don't think the military is looking to jump in and to run the country. I don't think they want to run the country. I think they're pretty satisfied with probably the position they're in. And why do you want to run this very difficult place? But they want to preserve those prerogatives. I don't think there's buyer's remorse in that sense. It does get to the issue of delivery, expectations. I mean, I always worry about, and this is true in Eastern Europe, and I worked at National Democratic Institute in the 1990s on democracy, and the concern was exactly that narrative that maybe the military had, which was, look around, democracies are successful. So if we just were a democracy, this is easy, we'll be successful. It's not that easy. It's not a quick turn. You have illiberal democracies, you have problems of social unrest, you have maybe oppositions who come in who don't know how to govern, which happens in every country. And institutions have to be built. I mean, democracy is about institutions as much as anything else. Dewey said that, in Indonesia, it's a work in progress. Every democracy is a work in progress. That's foundational. That's the definition of democracy, is that it's a work in progress. That every generation has to decide what kind of country it is because it's owned by this diverse people. And that's true in our own country. And every deficit of democracy that we can say in Asia, we can say is happening and that we're not immune to. So I think the expectation factor is tough in these places. And I just think it comes back to, Winston Churchill's famous line, it's a cliche, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Yeah. So what is the alternative? It's messy, it's difficult, it's not, it just makes you show your dirty laundry everywhere. But what is the alternative? And there will be backsliding. There will be demagogues who take advantage of it. One-party systems, but this is a steadily evolving thing that will have forward progress and backsliding. We have to get used to the backsliding, but keep our eye on building institutions, staying true to the people, because the people tend to want democracy, and not just have a snapshot of every particular moment.
All right, well, you won me over. Let's use the remaining 15 minutes to let folks in the audience ask questions. We've got microphones. I see a gentleman waving his hand in the third row here. Please introduce yourself and make it a question and a brief one.
Ambassador Mitchell, 2 years ago when I went to Sittwe and Yangon, I was amazed at the disdain that your mission showed for
I'm not hearing a question. And
yes,
did you
sir.
Introduce yourself?
My name is James Harbison. I used to work for Public Radio International.
Okay.
My question is, and I do have a question, is why was your mission so disdainful for soft power initiatives? Your mission in Yangon offered an English class and maintained an English library of English books, but you didn't teach American principles or American law or religious freedoms. Why did, like the Germans and the French did in Yangon, why did you have contempt for soft power?
Let me rephrase your question if I could.
No, I'd like to answer that.
Okay.
That's completely wrong. That's utterly, completely wrong.
But Derek, let's broaden the question to what role should major democracies like the United States, like Japan, like Europe, play in an emerging democracy? And you have the experience as an ambassador of trying.
No, the American Center, before I got there even, which, by the way, is now housed in the former North Korean embassy. They're moving to a new place, I think next year, or this year now, was fundamentally about teaching English and in the process teaching principles of democracy. It's exactly what they did. It was their haven. It was people's, whether political prisoners or activists, that was their haven to go to, quote, learn English and to then learn about American principles. I was once guided in to an Independence or National Day event, and the woman from the Foreign Ministry whispered to me and said, "I learned English and the principles from the American Center. Don't tell anyone." I mean, they're all over, and we promoted this. I'm not sure where you're getting this, but you're completely wrong. I mean, this is what we did on a daily basis, and every word that came out of my mouth was about principles of democracy, not necessarily American. I mean, it is American, but principles of democracy and such. I think we have a role. I would defer to my colleagues here about how they viewed it in the countries, but we had a very privileged position in the country. They really did look up to us, young people. They saw us as a beacon. Even people in the government, we were sort of the gold standard. And it was in some ways quaint and almost, I had one person, very distinguished leader, when, you were there maybe, when Secretary Clinton went on their first visit. You may know who it was. A senior person in the system say, we've been studying your Congress, and I've been going online and learning about how to be a parliamentary system, et cetera. Said, we want to be as effective as the U.S. Congress.
Right.
And we were like,
we won't tell you what.
We were like, you're looking at each other, looking down, going, oh, raise your standards just a bit, But there was that quaint, and we try to use that to say we don't have it exactly right. We've made mistakes in our look on TV. You can see the mistakes that we make. But here are the lessons learned, and here's how we can. No, he was very honest about it. I mean, and these are the things. This is what we believe in. We tried to talk to that. So I don't want to sound too defensive, but that's. I do believe that America has a really important role.
And could I just add, this ties into a broader question that came in online, which is what can the U.S. or others do to promote civil society in Asia?
I think it's extremely important. The role of like in Indonesia, like Ford Foundation, like the Asia Foundation, and so on and so forth, and many other countries. In terms of capacity building, it's very important. So external powers, democratic powers, do have many roles. Firstly, it's as a role model. If the United States in the past were like the light up on the hill, people wanted that to share that kind of American ideals, and by being who you are, it is important because people have something that they want to fight for. But then the actual policy of giving assistance to universities, to research institutions, like things like I was a congressional fellow, looking at. In fact, that's why I decided to become a full-time academic. So I didn't want to go into politics after that.
You're welcome.
But yeah, but that, like the technique, that mechanics of democracy building, the ones that don't get into the headlines. That's the role of institutions from Western developed democracies, that they can offer. But at the same time, the role has to be calibrated. Ownership is extremely important in democratic transitions. Democratic transition, democratic development has to be seen to be locally owned. Lesson from the 1950s, it was seen to be externally imposed. So if it is regarded as hegemonically imposed by a dominant power outside, the democracy promoters would lose credibility internally because they will be seen, as foreign agents, Western agents. So for Indonesia, that led us to a very important decision, actually, that when Indonesia received so many supports from the countries offering not just financial assistance but elections assistance, the President Habibie at the time asked the UNDP, which of course only works on development issues, they don't work on political democratic promotion, but the President Habibie asked the UNDP to manage the funds from all of the donor countries, and so that you will not have the Australians claiming one village and the Scandinavians claiming another village and the Americans doing other things. So the UNDP acted as a trust holder, for example, to disburse funds, because the UN is considered to be a common denominator for every country, and Indonesia is a member of the UN. Yeah. So we can tell our people that this is internationally managed, not by America, which would not sell it very well, or by Australia, or by the British. So it is very, very dangerous for the health of a democracy in Asia and Africa if they were to read in the papers that, we make Myanmar into a democracy,
Exactly.
we make Indonesia into a democracy. Then, those who are anti-democracy will say, well, this is a Western plot, and which would undermine the credibility of the democratic movement. So, that role has to be very calibrated.
Thank you, Dewi. Let's try to get another question in. The gentleman right in the second row, please. Can we get the microphone? Well, very familiar looking.
Jerry
gentleman.
Cohen
Hey, Jerry.
from NYU Law School. Could we hear from each of the speakers the role of the legal system, the courts, the legal profession, lawyers, in political development in your respective countries?
Okay, can I think about that?
Well, in connection with political reform.
Okay. In connection to political reform. Okay, this is really tricky because I'm really not an expert on that, and less so an expert on the legal profession in the Meiji era. So, and that, I think one characteristic maybe of the Japanese system is that people who work for the ministries or the bureaucracy tended to have a legal background education, more so than you might imagine from what tends to be known as Japan as the developmental model. You tend to think of them as economists, but it's actually less so. And I think that I'm not really sure if this is something to export in a way that you were mentioning, but in terms of development, it was very important that the legal profession and the legal expertise was sound in the state building period and also after the war. So I just don't have a point of comparison where that was less of the case in Japan and things didn't succeed, but it's not really in the main. And I guess the other thing is that I guess in Japan, the role of the courts is not so much into people's minds, maybe, than in the U.S. system, just because we have a different system than the U.S. in terms of how the balances work. But I think that in terms of respect for the legal system and the judiciary is very strong, and I think that did, like in hindsight, might have played a role in the political legitimacy of the post-war system compared to the pre-war. Might have been not that thing people think of first off the list, but the trust in the judiciary did have something to do with the confidence that the government had. But that's like a very rounded answer.
Well, in Indonesia, the new order government said, it was not rule of law, but rule by law. So it used to pass laws, but very undemocratic laws, put it that way, and it was legalese. And there was no way to have judicial review. So one of the new thing that developed after Reformasi is that in the constitutional amendment, we created a new court, the Constitutional Court. So the legal profession is not it's not so much the litigation side, but becoming constitutional experts, constitutional lawyers became very, very important because they decide on elections disputes. They decide also on disputes between institutions. So if there are disputes between certain elements of the government, then if it touches on authority, that which is governed by the constitution, then they will be the one to decide that. And importantly, the role of judicial review. So now you can take a case, and a citizen can ask for the court, for the Constitutional Court, to review a particular law, for example. For example, on individual candidacy, can an individual run for president if he is not backed by a party, example? That kind of disputes can be decided by the Constitutional Court, and they're creating precedents all the time. So the new lucrative business is for constitutional lawyers, which in the old days they were very poor. They're not because there were not that many calls for them. But now it's super active because, as I said, they adjudicate on electoral disputes. Although they have now decided to use the Supreme Court to adjudicate on lower level. But most importantly, a lot of new laws are immediately taken to the Constitutional Court to be challenged, whether they have impinged on somebody's constitutional right.
Thank you, Dewi.
I mean, the short answer is that the judiciary is extremely weak, extremely controlled, and extremely corrupt. And it really didn't have much of an impact, I would say, on the transition. This was Aung San Suu Kyi's priorities as rule of law and strengthening the judiciary. I think she's hasn't been able to focus on that, and I don't see much progress. But that's a short answer to your question, I would say.
Yes.
I don't mean to go back to the question we have, but in terms of democracy as a model question and external actors, I think that Japan tends to be known for the development model, and that's what people read about. But I think it is actually interesting to think about a country that experienced major backsliding. And of course, the situation is very unique. Either it's imperialist age or total defeat that triggered the next phase of democratization. I think there's still some positives that Japan can bring in the democracy picture, too, in Asia, which I think Japan is not known to be a major democracy expert. I think they've been very hesitant about that aspect, maybe. And I think what they're doing, what the government is doing, is actually de facto that in some cases, like trying to promote human rights, human security, or to training, police, whatever, for stable institutions and all that. So I think it's the question of, given what's happening in the US, whether Japan wants to kind of carry the torch of that, if that's something that Japan will choose in terms of thinking about democracy in Asia. And I think the experience of a country which went through various phases, including backsliding, could provide very important lessons for countries that's trying to go from semi to full-fledged democracy, for them to not repeat what Japan did.
If I could say, I mean, Dewey's actually absolutely right that the worst thing, and completely wrong, is to suggest that the United States had that much to do with it. I mean, this is the responsibility of a country. It's the sacrifices of the individual country to determine its future. And for the United States, I think we have to, the best thing we can do for democracy promotion is get our own house in order. It's the model question. They look towards who succeeds, how do they succeed, and when we don't, and I'm sure, this is speaking probably to a New York audience, not very controversial, but it really is true that only when you live up to those principles can they be more powerful in representing a model that's not imposed or not pushed, and it's not American, it's simply successful in something they then want for themselves.
Great. Well, you've all made some fantastic points, and I genuinely wish that we had more time and could keep on going. I guess I'd come back to, I think, the very powerful point, Dewey, that you made, which is that coercive, authoritarian, non-democratic governments have a kind of sell-by date. They're in a perpetual crisis of legitimacy, that a single pillar, security, economic growth, et cetera, is too fragile to hold up the entire institution of any national political system. People's hunger for protection of their rights and for legitimate freedoms requires strong institutions to protect those rights. It requires strong institutions of government to deliver public goods, particularly economic growth and opportunity. And it also requires periodic elections to replenish the legitimacy that comes from allowing people to choose their representatives and ultimately choose their leaders. Well, we have a lot to learn from these three examples, and I think a better fix of both the lessons learned and the challenges ahead. So with that, let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.